Welcome everyone to our second Tana focused live session here as part of AP Productivity Cohort 6. So I'm pleased to have you all here with me at what is this morning for me. I'm sure it's different times, other places here. So I'm going to share my screen to start with and walk through, in particular, some recurring patterns. So being productive, one of the main tenets of AP Productivity is that being productive means being effective at capturing recurrence, those things that happen regularly. If we recognize them and we have great patterns in place to accomplish those kinds of tasks, we free up a lot of our own time. We make it a lot easier for ourselves to be efficient and effective. And so I want to explore how we can do some of that in Tana. In particular, we're going to aim to capture recurrence here today at three different levels. One is at the level of the individual task with recurring tasks. The second is at the level of essentially a process checklist, which I call procedures in the recurring form. And the third is at the level of a full project, what I call recipes when we talk about a project template. And so, and you'll find when I get there, there are a couple little manual steps still, and that may be partly my ignorance. There may be better ways to do that in Tana, and it may also be simply that Tana has a couple things that would be helpful for doing that, or the slightly different pattern from the way I'm doing it. So anyway, I'm going to share my screen over here and dive right in. So as long as I have it right here, that everybody should be seeing a split screen here with my list of what I'm doing on the right side and where I'm going to be demoing here on the left. So first of all, I want to talk about recurring tasks. Recurring tasks are those things that happen, generally speaking, every day, though I captured recurring tasks that happen every day just simply in my day tag, every week, every month, or every year. And of course, they might also happen every quarter or twice a week or something along those lines. We want to be able to capture that as much as possible as well. The only part I won't cover today is slightly extending the recurring tasks to handle things that happen like every other week. That's a little bit, requires a little extra layer, nothing complicated, but enough that I didn't want to get confusing here with this flow. So anything though that happens more than once a week or weekly or monthly, we're going to talk about here. So in order to capture the front end, to be able to capture the what is the actual recurring task, we need to build ourselves a super tag for recurring tasks and some fields here. Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm going to lay out a recurring actions recurring task tag. As you can see, I've already got that made here. And in that recurring task tag here, we're going to configure that. So notice I'm clicking on it and then choosing configure. And as I do that, you can see in here that I have three fields set up. For those who may be seeing this video very first and having not done this yet, the greater than sign is how you create a new field. So each of these were created with that greater than sign. Days of the week, days of the month, and dates of the year. And all of these are populated with, I'm going to click here on this little box next to days of the week to configure the field. All of these are populated with fixed options. And so our fixed options here for the days of the week are, not surprisingly, the days of the week, Sunday through Saturday. And I have those as fixed options because obviously, unless there's some sort of cataclysm coming up that I don't know about, the days of the week are not going to change. Those are fixed options. The days of the month are also fixed options. I've done the first four or so here. You would have all of them there. I'm also going to include, since today that I'm doing it is a 31st, I'm going to include a 31st because I'll need that. And you would have all of them here, not just 1 through 7 and then 31, but all of the days of the month. And likewise, the dates of the year. I also have that as fixed options, and I have them all in there. So I would have 0103, 0104. Would I type them out by hand? I would not. I would go online, and I will actually, I can share this in a separate demo. I don't want to do it here, but you can, it's easy enough to find generators of dates online that you can just copy and paste the whole thing. For the sake of our demo today, I'm going to make sure I include a couple of the days that are around the current date. That way that nothing will be lost. But you wouldn't just have 7 dates here. You would have every single date. I include February 29th because you never know. It might be a leap year. But by having the fixed options, you may ask, well, why in the world would you do this with fixed options? Why wouldn't you just add a new date as it arises? I do it for error control. If I have only the options that are available as actual dates to choose from, when I start typing those here in a moment, it makes it far less likely I'm going to accidentally type a date wrong because I'm controlled. I have the fixed options only to choose from. So that's the reason for doing this, and actually finding a thing from scratch. When I found it and generated these, I don't know, maybe it took me maybe 5 minutes to get it all done, and then I never have to do it again because the field is created and I don't have to mess with it. And hopefully at some point down the road we'll have built-in recurring tasks in Tana, but until we do, this is actually working quite well. So that is how this main part of the recurring task is set up. This is what the schema of it looks like, is that we have the days of the week, the days of the month, the dates of the year, and each of those has the fixed options that you would expect each of those to have. Okay, so for now, the idea behind creating recurring tasks, we'll need to create a few of them here in order to not only demonstrate the next part, but also show you how they're created. So let's imagine I have a few recurring tasks in my system. The one that always comes to mind first is put out the trash. And we will imagine, for the sake of argument here, mine is actually on Wednesday, but we will imagine that that is actually something that happens here on Monday. And you notice, first of all, let me back up one step. I kind of showed that quickly. If you have Control or Command down, depending on if you're on Windows or Mac, that will open up this so you can see that. And you can also, if you hover over here, you'll have a little arrow here. Just like if there were bullet points beneath this, same thing for fields. You can open up the fields underneath. So I have the fields here, and you notice I'm not going to use the drop down. I could for days of the week because there are only 7. I'm actually just going to start typing, because when I hit M, the only day that's got an M in it anywhere is Monday. And so that's going to come up. I can just hit enter, and I've chosen Monday. So putting out the trash is something that's going to happen on Monday every week. I won't add day of the month or date of the year because it's not related to those. It's only related to day of the week. So we'll just leave that alone. That is a recurring task that has been successfully created. Let's create a couple more here, and I'm going to show a little trick as we go. So let's say pay the credit card bill. Let's say pay the mortgage. Let's say go to the grocery store, which I wouldn't necessarily put as a recurring task myself, but it'll work. Prepare a project for this year's taxes. And then we'll say get the car inspected. And we'll add one other, get the car's oil changed. And notice I didn't tag any of those recurring tasks as recurring tasks, because you can do that all at once. If I highlight all of those and I just simply hit that hashtag and choose start typing recurring task, I can tag them all recurring tasks at once. So now they're all tagged as recurring tasks. Let's say that pay the credit card bill is something that happens once a month, and we'll put that on the 31st, since that's today here, and we can be able to help us see that. Let's say pay the mortgage happens once a month too, but it happens on the 1st. And then let's say go to the grocery store is something I do once a week, and I always, for whatever reason, do it on Tuesday. Let's say preparing a project for this year's taxes is something that I always do on October 31st. Let's say that getting the car inspected is something that I always do on November 1st. And now let's imagine that getting the car's oil changed is something that I do 4 times a year, and that one of those dates happens to be October 31st, but I also do it on January 31st, and I also do it that found it. I don't have a 31st in there. Say January 1st, and just for the sake of argument, let's say I also do it on November 2nd. I don't know why I do it on October 31st and then again on November 2nd. A lot of driving in there, but that's the idea of how you would set that up. Okay, so now I have created all of these recurring tasks, and just to kind of walk back through it, let me highlight the whole shebang here and open them up so you can see them. You can do that as well. You can open a bunch of things at once. So you can see here that put out the trash is going to be weekly on Monday, pay the credit card bill monthly on the 31st, pay the mortgage monthly on the 1st, go to the grocery store days of the week. And actually, just for the sake of argument, let's say we also do that on Friday. So we do that on Fridays as well. And that will then also show up on Fridays if I were to, when you see how I do the other part of this. And then we have a couple that are tied to the dates of the year and so forth. And you can see I can handle things that might happen quarterly by just dividing them up across the year. That's what's nice about things like quarters, is that they are just a division of a year. And even if you had something that occurs every other month, often it's useful to just frame it as an annual task. The reason every other week is hard is that weeks do not connect logically to months. Weeks just overlap with months in chaotic ways, whereas months and years interact logically. You know that the end of December is going to also be the end of the year. So that's the reason it's hard to encapsulate every other week, but easy to encapsulate every other month as something that's just 6 times annually. That's much simpler than every other week. Regardless, so that little note aside there, that's what we have, and that's how we are going to have those set up. Now, if what we do here is in our super tag for day, you see I have day up here. What we're going to add is a search that allows us to get at those recurring tasks. I mentioned in the last on the live session that anytime you have an input in the form of fields, you want to have some kind of output in the form of searches that is dependent on those fields. Either it's searching for those fields directly, or it's using them in some way to sort or group or filter. And this is the case here as well. Saving them as recurring tasks in Tana does you no good unless you are also then querying those tasks. So once we've done that, then we're in a position that we can get some use out of them. In order to do that, I'm going to do that at the actual day tag level. So I'm going to click on day, and I'm going to click configure. And within that now, you can see the top level I have here is called agenda. There's a reason I have agenda at the top level and these various searches nested underneath. And that is the top level of a super tag. You can't move things around. If I had all of today's tasks overdue and tasks for this week at the top level where agenda is, when I say top level, I'm talking about indentation level. If I have those at the top level where agenda is, instead of having agenda and then them indented one level, I can't maneuver things up and down, or, as I'll show you in a minute, do anything where I use Shift Tab to bring things from a search into the page. It doesn't work effectively if I'm not one level deep. Now, that doesn't really matter as being an issue. It's perfectly fine to set it up this way, but that's why I have it that way. And so what we're going to add to this is a recurring tasks search, so that each day I have then a node from which I can find these recurring tasks. So I will find nodes, and we're looking not this time for to-dos, but rather for recurring tasks. And we want to grab them as a list. Now, I'm going to modify this query here in a moment. So right now we've just got a list. This search is just pulling in every single recurring task, okay? Which we're going to rename it here to recurring tasks, so it isn't that awkward name there. And then in the query, this is the fancy footwork you have to have set up here in order for this to work. In the query, what we need is to see every task for this day. And this day that we're on right now has a few different parameters to it. This day could be a day of the week. Well, it's always going to be a day of the week. It can be a day of the month, and it can be a date of the year. So we want to see tasks that align with the day of the week, or the day of the month, or the date of the year. And so we have a handy or operator here. You can see we've already got it set up to look for recurring tasks. Now we're going to add our or operator. And with that or, we're going to say that it has to have a day of the week, or a day of the month, or a date of the year. And note, for each of those, I started that with a greater than sign. That's what allowed me to search them as fields. Now, I'm not going to say what they are in the definition here in the day tag, because I'm going to set those on the day when I arrive. Now, it's possible I might be able to pull that off with like a grandparent, and maybe that's working now. Parent wasn't parent, I believe, is working now, and just add the update that came like this morning, but I haven't had time to experiment with that in order to do it in a live setting. But I believe we might already be to a place where we can pull off some sort of expression where we can initialize this to look for a day of the week based on what the date is. But we don't need to worry about that, because it takes about 10 seconds to set what the actual date is manually. So I'm not going to mess with that here in a moment. And it wouldn't be just grandparent, by the way, because that would give you the date, where we'd have to do some manipulations on the date to get what the day of the week is and so forth. That's why I'm not going to worry about that. Yes, I'm sorry. Hello?
It's Ed.
Yes.
So this query, if the super tag is recurring task, why then go through the trouble of saying day of the week, day of the month, day of the year? Is it in case you haven't applied the super tag recurring task? Or do you want to pull in only those recurring tasks that have dates associated with them?
Yes, I only want to pull in. It's because on the day I'm going to set what day of the week, day of the month, day of the year it is. So if when I move to the next phase, I need to set that, because right now there are only 7 because I just created them. But in my system, I have about 85. And so I don't want to go through the list of 85 manually to figure out which belong on the day. I want to be able to adapt the query to be able to do that. Now, you could do that. It's a good question, because you could do it with filters. The reason I don't use filters is that filters don't have the handy search option that the inquiries do. So I'll show that in a moment here. But the reason I do that is I'm actually going to, once I get to the day, I am going to narrow it down to that actual day. That's why.
So this is all in preparation.
This is in preparation of that. That is correct. So this is the setup in the day tag that will allow me to do that here momentarily. And when I say momentarily, I mean like now, over on the day. Okay. So let me close up this query here. I'll save it for everybody, since this is in the shared graph. And at the moment, you'll notice it still pulls every single one, because I haven't specified, just like Ed was asking there, I haven't specified anything as a particular day yet. So we're gonna close out this day schema, and now we're gonna move over to our Monday, October 31st. Okay. And actually, just for the sake of not having these here, let me move these off. I'm going to Control K, move to, and I'm going to stay in the same graph here. I'll move them over to the library, and I'm only doing that. That has nothing to do with anything except just simplifying the visual of the demo, so that these aren't also living here. I'm going to delete the references. Now they're living over in the library. They still exist, but they're not here on this page for the sake of the demo. So I now have, because I put them in the day schema, I now have recurring tasks available for Monday, October 31st. And when I open it up, I'll see all of those same tasks still there, because I haven't adapted it. This is what I do. Okay. And I'm going to show it a couple times, because not just so you see it, but in terms of working through it, when I talk through it here, it's going to take me like a minute and a half. When I actually do it live, it takes me 30 seconds or less. So this is a very easy thing to do at the beginning of your day, or whenever you're setting this up. I actually do it at the end of the day. Let me close this for a second, because I want you to be able to see the whole screen here. So what I do is, today is a Monday. So I say Monday is the day of the week, or because today is the 31st, It's a day of the month there, 31st, and day of the year is October 31st. So having all three of those set, I click done, and now you see only those things that are related to either you can't use with three, but you get the idea. Either Tuesday, or excuse me, Monday, or 31st, or October 31st remain. So that's how I get them filtered down. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I can use a filter to do that, but filters I have to use as a drop down, and I don't want to use a drop down. I want to use what I did there a moment ago where I can type, and that's why I do it live in the query rather than as filters. You could do filters when you're dealing with like 7, but it would be a lot, harder if you weren't. The next step is a really important one, okay? Because it allows you to do the duplication that I'm about to do that turns these from recurring tasks into to-dos. Let me talk very briefly theory here. A recurring task is not a to-do. A recurring task is a blueprint for a to-do. So if I have because I don't want to change the original setup for the recurring task, because if I do that task, it doesn't exist anymore. The recurring task is the blueprint for the to-do I'm going to do today. And that is what you're about to see me initiate here, okay? I'm going to highlight all of these. These are living in the query, and I'm hitting Shift-Tab. And now you'll notice, and it said all over here, reference added to parent, reference added to parent, over and over. It now brought all of those out to the same level as the searches. So it is now living directly inside the agenda. Now that those are out here, I can safely remove the recurring task query because it's no longer relevant to me. I have these living on the agenda itself. But remember, these are still references to the original recurring task, and recurring tasks are not to-dos. They are blueprints for to-do. So we actually need to highlight them. I'm using Shift-Alt-D. You could use Shift-Command-D on a Mac to duplicate them. And now this is subtle, and this let me actually size up the screen a little bit here so you can see this subtlety. The ones that are still highlighted in blue are the references because I haven't undone the highlight. But you'll notice they have these little dotted lines still around those node bullets. That's an indication that they are a reference. They're still pointing back to the recurring task where we originally created them. They're in the library now. These here do not have a dotted line because they are now duplicates of that. They're still recurring tasks. I haven't changed that yet, but I'm about to. But these are now free of the original reference. And that, once again, just like I did in deleting the query, I can now delete the references. Now, this is the switch over. This is where the blueprint becomes the reality. I highlight them, Command or Control K, remove tag, recurring task, and then hashtag add tag to do. And now they are officially, they have been born as tasks that are not connected to the original recurring tasks that they came from. And at this point, I would use them in the same way I would do any other task. I'm not going to dive into the particulars of the agenda creation right now. I will do that as we layer more things in another live here. But that's how they get to the agenda. Let me show that again. You notice I prepped some for Tuesdays and firsts as well. I did that because that means we can go to tomorrow and we can do the same thing again. So you can watch that happen one more time. Okay? And this time I'm not going to narrate quite as intensely so that you can see that it is actually a fairly smooth process. I will still explain it, but I'm going to do it briefly. This is the agenda. As you know, because we have it in a day tag, the recurring actions comes along with it. I open the recurring tasks. We're now on Tuesday. It is the 1st, and specifically the 1st of November. Having said all of those, I now click done. The only tasks remaining, sorry, that does that sometimes when your cursor's in the way. The only tasks remaining are the ones that are set up for either a Tuesday or a 1st of the month or a specifically November 1st. I highlight them, tab them back to the main level of the agenda, delete the recurring task query, it's no longer relevant, and then I do the work to make sure that I don't actually do the recurring task, I'm turning them into to-dos, duplicate, That time it split them up for some reason, but you can see the ones highlighted are still the references. Delete the references. And then with these, Control K, remove tag, recurring task, add tag, to do. Still narrating that, and even with narrating it, I did it in less than a minute. When I'm doing it in my own graph, it takes me, as I say, 30 seconds or less, and I have them in there. Would it be nice if there were out-of-the-box recurring tasks in Tana? Yes, and I suspect that will come. But in the meantime, this works very smoothly for me to be able to get from the idea of having a blueprint in a recurring task and bringing that through to having that as a to-do on a given day. That is recurrence at the task level. Let me bring this size back down slightly. I know it's nice to have it very large there, but I can't have my screen side by side at that size. Let me now open this back up. Actually, if I have that open, it'll probably mess with me. Let me just mouse over it here. And then I'll open this by control clicking it. We can move this back to side by side. Okay, so that's how I'm using this recurring tasks setup on a day-to-day basis. It's pretty easy to set up. Once you set up a recurring task tag, you just set it up with a day of the week, day of the month, date of the year. The date of the year is the hardest. It's the one that requires us to go online and get ourselves a list or spend a while typing. Or you don't necessarily have to use fixed options like I do, but I think it's the best bet. It would be possible to create a date of the year tag and use instances of that. So that, I mean, I could imagine a scenario where you could do it that way as well. But this one takes, as I say, 5 minutes to set up, and then will work indefinitely. You don't have to worry about doing it anymore. And then once you have that set up, it's just a question of building the search so that it finds instances of recurring tasks that are and then have an or for the current day of the week, the current day of the month, the current date of the year. And then you flip them around so they're no longer tasks and they're to-dos. So you can rewatch that if you need to. I did it twice, so hopefully that you can get a sense of the flow of that as you do that. Let me move on now. So we talked about the task level of recurrence. I'm going to move on to the procedure level of recurrence. So when I talk about procedures, I'm talking about recurring processes, checklists of things that you need to do on a regular basis. So let's talk about what a procedure would need to look like. I'm going to just close up agenda here so it's not, and I'll go back actually to today as well. Let's look at what a procedure tag should be. So if I create procedure as a new tag here, what I want to be able to capture, I'm going to click on procedure and then go to configure. What I want to be able to capture is a little bit of information about what this checklist is. Because when I run a procedure, it's going to run on a specific date. I am going to include a field called date. And this one is one that this is a new date field that I'm going to configure. I just clicked on that little button there that next to the date as a date. And I'm going to auto initialize to current date. And what that means is when I run this a procedure, in this case, we wouldn't ever run the one that's literally called procedure, but we're going to extend this tag here momentarily, and I'll show you how to do that. But we're going to, anytime you run it, it'll just give the date that it's currently on, which will then track a record of when you actually are running the various procedures, which is useful to have. Then we're going to include a field for what I call purpose. This is for documentation purposes. So when you create a procedure, you can say what it is and what you're doing with it. And then we're going to create a field called checklist. And that's the list of tasks that we actually do as part of the procedure. Now, having created this tag called procedure, we actually aren't going to use that tag directly. Every time we create a new procedure, we are going to extend this tag so that each procedure is a procedure. And that way, I mentioned documentation purposes for the field purpose. Documentation also allows us then to gather all of our procedures with a simple search. I can just look for all of my procedures, and every single procedure with all the various tags that extend procedure will be available, and I can see in my system everything that I've built. If I need to go find something, it's very simple to find with a search of all procedures. And since all procedures will share these things, it's useful to group them in one place like this. So let me explain what I mean by, first of all, searching for all of my procedures. Well, no, I'll do that in a minute because I don't have any to search for yet. We'll build a couple. Let's create what I'll call a Zoom procedure. And I'm going to keep these straightforward. I'm not necessarily saying these are the exact way to build these procedures, but I want to show you this is the way to, or I should say, not exactly the checklist that would belong with the procedure, but this is the way that you would build them. So let's imagine that I wanted to have a Zoom setup checklist to run with a meeting that I need to do. So I have a meeting at 12, and I want to have a checklist reminder for how to set up that particular that meeting on Zoom. I can create a new tag called Zoom meeting checklist. And notice I'm saving that as the tag. And the reason I'm saving that as the tag is that I can then configure that. Now I'm going to look here. I'm going to go down here to advanced. I'm going to say extend an existing tag, and we're going to go extend procedure. By extending procedure, you'll note we get date, purpose, and checklist. This is important. We're actually going to build this checklist in the schema for Zoom meeting checklist. Okay, you can put what the purpose of Zoom meeting checklist is: to set up a Zoom meeting so that I'm ready to record, we'll say. Okay, and then in this checklist box, we can just list all the things that we need to do. Really nothing super complicated about that. Turn on ring light. Is that actually a brand name? Maybe it's just a lowercase r. I don't know. Turn off computer speakers, set up microphone, adjust zoom level. I should definitely lowercase that because zoom is what we're saying here. Zoom level of webcam, and so on and so forth. It can, whatever you need on this list. I don't set them up as to-dos. I just highlight them and then use either control or command enter to turn them into checks. And what that allows me to do then is anytime I run a Zoom meeting checklist, and this one didn't show up at the date because I built the thing afterward. But if I were to then, start this again from scratch, let's take this one out and say meeting at 12. And then I do that Zoom meeting checklist. I go down here, it pre-populates with today's date because we click that little box in date. And it comes here with the purpose, what it is, and all of the checks that I need. I use this sort of thing regularly. I have, in fact, this morning was my weekly business networking BNI meeting, and I'm the president, and so I'm running the computer setup. And so I have a list of things that I need to do. And if I forget one of them, it's going to be an awkward start to the meeting. And I do it exactly like this. I have a checklist set up, and now I have a little bit more because it's also an event. So I'm actually extending. Worth noting, I'm not going to demo it here because it's a little tangent to this, but a tag can extend more than one tag. So I have a BNI meeting, just tag, and it extends both event and procedure. And so I actually have a checklist for the things I need to do, but it also includes event information that would be coming from event. And it includes some additional spaces for me to be able to take notes and so forth down underneath. So if you can actually combine super tags when you're extending into new things. So worth noting. So let me give another example of how you might build another procedure, and then when we'll talk about how you search for them. So let's create a new one here. Let's imagine I said my Sunday morning checklist. So that's a good one for me. Every Sunday between masses at my church, I have a few things that I take care of while I'm there. So I'm going to create Sunday morning checklist. Remember, first things first in the configuration. First, we have to extend procedure. And then having extended procedure within the schema for Sunday morning checklist, I'm going to put my purpose, complete the tasks for between masses at church. And then my checklist will be check my church inbox, and then prepare Fourscore, which is a music app, for next service, and then plan music for upcoming weeks as needed. And I have a couple other things, but that'll give you the idea. I highlight them, Command or Control Enter, and now I have my checklist for there. And so on a Sunday morning, and this actually arrives via recurring action. So I have this is set up as a recurring action, and it comes in that way as well. It's a recurring task that reminds me to do the Sunday morning checklist. And so I would have that complete Sunday morning checklist. We'll have the tag of Sunday morning checklist. And when I do that, it'll have the day, it'll have the purpose, and it'll have each of the lists on the tasks on that list that I need to do in order to complete that procedure. So the important points being these extend procedure so that you have all of that valuable date and purpose and checklist stuff, and so that you can search for them, which we'll do in a moment here. And also once you've got them that way, when you create the new checklist, do it in the schema for the new checklist, because that way every time you run it, you'll have exactly the same checklist. And if you ever want to update it or change it, do it in the schema, because that way each time you do it, there will be a new setup for that. Oh yes, and Adam asked how you add the hidden field. Yes, absolutely. So let's imagine that for whatever reason I didn't want to have purpose listed in every one of these. I do, but let's imagine that I didn't for the sake of it. When you click on the field set up for purpose, and you go down here to advanced, well, it's not clicking on anything right now. My computer's warming up there. I think it was just slow there. Something happened. Down here, 5 deep is hide field conditions. And you can choose when empty, when not empty, when value is default, and so on and so forth. I believe, unless I'm mistaken, I believe I can also do that with a Control K. Yes, I can choose hide field conditions right from within the field. I don't think that was available until relatively recently, but now you don't have to go down into that weird looking place. Within the field, you can hit Control or Command K and choose hide field conditions. You'll get the same options: when empty, when not empty, when value is default, that sort of thing. So, and actually, that's a good use for the date one there, since I'm setting a default for that. If I do the value as default, that means that it can hide it when it's default, and so forth. So that's how you can set that in that way. Okay. So that's the layout here for how you would set up a procedure. Complete Sunday tasks. We'll put that back in there. And the reason I'm putting that back in there is you can have at the top level of your system, I'm going to leave it at the today level just for the sake of simplicity, but you could always build it at the top level, a search for all your procedures. So I could have a find node tagged procedure, and I can bring them as a list, but what I'm going to actually do is turn them into a table. And when I have them listed now as a table, I can see, every time that I've done these checklists, what they are. And it's a really valuable and useful way to be able to kind of track back through, and you could make adjustments and so forth in this. Now, you wouldn't want to make it directly here because these are instances of the checklist, but you can see what you've done and track back through what you've, what you're working from here. And notice the important part here is as you tag procedure, neither of these are tag procedure, but because they extend procedure, they both show up as procedures. You could then filter by the ones that you've, the number of times you've done the Zoom meeting checklist here. You could filter by purpose if you really wanted to. You'll notice the values are there. That allows you, if you have any situation where you don't recall something that you've built, which can happen, it's easy enough to go in and you can find them because you've prepared them this way as you do that. So that is, um, so if I actually check them off, do I eliminate them from the procedure super tag? No. Once I have the original instance, once I have an instance of it, no. So I'll open the schema here so you can see what I mean. So if I were to, can I get that table moved over? Let me just swap this back to a list here so I have room. Yeah, so this is my meeting at 12. Actually, I just do it directly. I have my Zoom meeting checklist. So I have the schema open over here so you can see that. Didn't delete when I clicked it. There we go. If I click them off here, it'll have no effect on the schema because the schema is the original and the that won't affect that there. If I were to click them off in the schema, then subsequent versions, this one is already separate because it's been created, but subsequent versions would have them checked off. So as long as you keep them unchecked in the schema, they will work correctly over here. All right. And I'll tell you what, I'm looking at the time and I see it's 12, quarter to 12 here. And I do have a meeting at 12. So I think, let me schedule a separate session to move into the projects and recipes for that because I want to give space for you to be able to ask questions. And if I do the projects and recipes, it's going to push us to 12. So this is plenty. It's not short on content or anything like that, but I had wanted to cover the other layer of recurrence. I'll get a separate session in here to look at the projects and hubs. And I know, Brian, I apologize because that was one of the things you wanted to ask specifically about last time. I will get it demoed, but I want to make sure I give space for what particular questions related to what I demoed or not. It can be other Tana related things. Just want to make sure I don't move on without giving room for questions. So I will stop sharing for the moment. I'll reshare as needed to demo some things. So, questions? No questions at all? No comments? Is it just too confusing to even know what to ask questions about, or was it clear enough that you don't have any? Those are two different things.
I'm amazed.
Is that a good amazed or a bad amazed? Okay, good.
Yeah. I love your brain, RJ.
Thank you.
I'm good. I did. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I finally got a chance to play with Tana yesterday. I spent most of the afternoon with it, and I still feel comfortable implementing all of these, but I'm going to go by baby steps. And now that these sessions inspire me because I realize in the moments of frustration, because my brain doesn't work like yours for sure, I know what is possible, and I'm just kind of adding a brick on a brick on a brick. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully upon a couple reviews, this will be fairly clear how I sorted that out there. And also hopefully recurring actions will get easier over time.
RJ?
Yes, go ahead.
At the limit so far, how many procedures have you extended? So what's the
my own graph?
What's the outer limit of I've extended this procedure with this procedure with this procedure with this procedure?
So I wouldn't extend. I actually haven't gone more than one layer deep in terms of extending. Like everything is an extension of procedure that I've created. Nothing is like another layer deep, like I haven't extended Zoom to another layer, but you could. I have. I'm trying to think about if there's anything else other than procedure that I've gone 2 layers deep. Off the top of my head, I don't recall. You certainly would be able to do that, but I don't. I have the Sunday morning checklist is one that I have. I actually don't have a Zoom meeting checklist for myself, but I do have my BNI meeting checklist, which effectively has some Zoom related checklists at the beginning of it. That's a procedure that I have in my system. I have my weekly accomplishments. That is a procedure I have in my system. I have it laid out a little bit differently right now, which is why I didn't demo in my own system. I am in the one of the challenges is always, as I'm in the midst of my own iterations, I don't want to be confusing because I sometimes try a couple different things. But there are, and then I have my Monday morning self coaching. I have a few that are procedures that I use on a fairly regular basis, but none of them.
But it sounds like
others.
you're only going one layer further.
One layer further than procedure. Yeah. I haven't had a need to go further than that, but I mean, if I had, it would be easy enough to do. I could, let me give an example where I think that it would be logical, and that would be like a packing checklist for going on a trip. If I had a procedure is kind of a strong word for a packing checklist, but it's functionally the same. I could have a packing checklist that's my fundamental, these are the things that I'm always going to take kind of thing. And I could theoretically then extend that with additional things that might be for a business trip, or that might be for another kind of trip. We'd have to be careful. I'd have to explore that. It might work in the way the fields are set up, and it might not. I'd have to, before I take a strong commitment on that. You could definitely do it as individual items outside a field. But I'd have to check and make sure that I could extend, like, essentially, sorry, in my mind, there's theory happening. The extensions, will put a line beneath each time you extend something. You get a line that's kind of a hard line, that these are the things that came along with the extension, and these are the new things. What I wouldn't want to have, like, 4 or 5 separate checklist fields all beneath separate lines that were related. So I'd have to double check check that to be sure. But you certainly could still have like a master version of a packing list, and then have others that would be related to that. The challenge, and I know I've mentioned this, I don't know that I've mentioned this in the Tana session, but I know I've mentioned it in other course office hours. The challenge here is that I feel that there's a shading of template that Tana doesn't have yet that would be considerably valuable. And actually, that would have been that's what I use going from a project to a recipe. Is I don't and actually this will be news to Brian, because I actually sent an email last night that was slightly different, and then since last night I've slightly adjusted the way I think it needs to be done. I don't use extending a bunch of different recipes, which is my term for project templates. I use duplicate to get from a project to a recipe, and then I use duplicate again to get from a recipe back to from a template back to a project, because there's some things that I want to be, that just need to be duplicated, and some that I actually want to have listed as a checklist and a tag. And when I say there's some of this and some of that, that where that line is for me is still somewhat blurry. So I can't be completely definitive in my answer to that. But I do feel like there's a shading of template that leans toward the duplicate side that would be nice to have in Tana as well, which is something I've brought up. So I think it's something that's known, but just, I don't know if that answer is helpful or not. I went a little bit afield, but that's from the original question. But that's sort of where my the question of extension is mainly a question of where that line is between, it would be easier to duplicate something versus having a separate, completely separate instance version of that.
Right.
I saw a question in the chat here. How would we map out schema and relationships to keep track of this ... documentation? A skepticism around documentation implied by the ellipsis and the quotation marks. So when you say the schema to represent, do you mind elaborating on that a little bit so I understand what it is that we would need to build here?
I think it's just trying to look at the layers here. Like, right. What is a pattern versus what is, a list, and how do they connect? And
sure.
With automation, mapping out that automation so that we can, look at it and then test it and then make sure. I don't know. I feel like I get lost when we're building something and trying it versus documenting it.
Right. I understand. Well, and I think that you're talking about a thing there that is that is particularly challenging is that the same system that you'd be documenting things in is the same system that you're actually building and using them in, and those things become sort of blurry when you're trying to work with those. That's why you came off mute again there. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm thinking about the future of setting this up, and maybe I'm being too precious, but it's like, do I need to build a place for work that then can integrate with my personal workspace so that I have projects and schema that are related to work so that in the future I could invite someone into that space and keep it separate from personal. And similarly, building out templates and procedures and patterns around, a workspace, and then cloning them into my personal.
My inclination is, do that, because I think that the while you may not reap any benefits from doing it, the potential benefits are considerable, and there's no real drawback to building it out because workspaces can talk to one another, and because you can clone from one to another. Having a separate space in fact, you could have a third that's just your experimentation space. That then that is you have your personal, you have your work, and you have your experimentation. There's no cost in Tana to having that separate workspace because they can all talk to one another in a way that Rome graphs couldn't really talk to one another. I can't remember, Joshua, if you're somebody coming from Rome, but that's where my mind goes. And so I think that I would absolutely endorse that. I don't have that specific structure built in, but I absolutely do have a place that I call my testing space that I can go to and just fool around, because it clears out the other potential things that might be in the way, and lets me just focus on testing one thing at a time. That harkens back to, at the very beginning of this course, I said start with a blank slate. What's lovely about Tana is you can create a new blank slate at any time, not necessarily because that's where you now want to move everything to, but just if you want a testing space, it's very easy to create that testing space. And you can have one that's simply dedicated to the scheme of what you're building. What is a procedure and what fits under procedure. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to connect those with tags. You could just have it in plain text outlined, so that you had a place that you could just go and look. You could do what Brian and Carol demoed last week on one of the office hours. They're using visual, not even Tana. Brian was in Heptabase and Carol was in Curio, I think it was called. But it was, just a visual space that used cards that allowed them to lay out visually what they were trying to create, which then made it easier to come into Tana and build the relationships because there was a visual reference point for them. And again, that's kind of a very long answer to a question that, we could probably talk for hours and hours about. Is that helpful in any way?
Yeah, it's getting confused with the schema ontology and the logic around some of these fields, and how do you best kind of approach that. But
it's funny because I like Tracy compliments the way my brain works. When I see the words in various Twitter threads, schema and ontology, I'm like, okay. And I just go into Tana and try to make things happen. I'm not entirely sure the distinction between the two, or a couple of the other words that are used. And I don't mean, to be clear, I'm not being dismissive of those things. I value definitions, but at the same time, I think that what you're talking about there is probably best served by having a separate workspace like your inclination was, and even having perhaps another one where you can just throw everything at the wall and see what happens. There's no limit, there's no cost really associated with having that separate space. So I think it makes a lot of sense to do it.
Great, thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And I see I have a question here. Have you identified a way to add or generate randomness in Tana? For example, bringing in a random prompt for journaling. I have not explored that space, so I can't answer that at the moment. It may be doable. I'm certainly it's probably some outside way of generating the randomness that could come in, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet about that. I know that some of the people who are in the Tana space when they were in Rome were interested in that sort of thing. So I would be very surprised if there isn't something forthcoming. But yeah, I don't know offhand. Sorry. Excellent. Thank you all. What a fun time here. I enjoy doing these, and it's very helpful for me to kind of distill what it is that I need to articulate when I'm talking about these things going forward. So thank you for. Hopefully this is helpful upon rewatch. I think it clarifies the space around recurring tasks and procedures really well. We'll talk about projects and recipes. We already have one scheduled for next Monday. I imagine we'll keep on going with them as we go there. So, Ed, are you raising your hand or is that or applauding? Is that enough? Yay! Applause! Yay! All right. Thank you all. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.